welcome on behalf. Sorry for that, guys. The first question I kind of want to start off is this more personal route on the Democratic Party in itself. You know, originally in the United States, high school courses were taught, you know, that the Democratic Party is this party of kind of Labor Party, it's the party of FDR. But when I come back to New York, every Democrat I meet is this kind of Silicon Valley aspiring, executive, Patagonia-wearing individual. The question we have is, how has the Democratic Party become this kind of urbanite party as opposed to this labor working class party that it originally was intentioned to be?
That happened at the end of the 60s through the 70s, and as far as I understand it, and most of the dramas and tensions besetting the Democratic Party now can be traced in some way back to the 1970s. The oldest, if we want to begin our history of the Democratic Party with the oldest current Democrat running, is it Biden or Bernie? Are they the same age?
Bernie.
Okay, let's start with Biden, who is elected in 1973, and he himself embodies this transformation of the party as being a guy who has a certain feel of working class cred, Scranton-born, Delaware, Amtrak Joe, and so forth, a kind of a mystique of labor politics, but in fact he was the new Democrat, generation of the new Democrats who eventually sides with finance, the things we call neoliberalism, but it's partly structural changes in the economic and structural changes in the 70s and strategic changes on the part of the Democratic leadership that ultimately exclude labor from the coalition.
But what was this difference? So if I look at the 1960s and 1970s, what was an average Democrat before the 1960s, and what would you say is the average Democrat now?
Average Democrat before the 1960s?
Yeah, so what changed in the 1960s specifically?
Well, as far as the realignment of political parties, the real, it's the Civil Rights Act that on one hand sends racist whites to the to the Republican Party for good. So when Lyndon Johnson passes the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act in 1964 and 1965, he says something like, well, we've given up the South. So whatever the old segregationist Democratic bloc of the South was already partially going to the Republican Party, but those old bastards that Joe Biden speaks nostalgically for had been Southern Democrats who became Republicans in the wake of the Civil Rights era. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party, like both parties, were strange coalitions that are not natural coalitions. There's not a natural reason why northern working class whites or northern working class people of color would be in the same political coalition, would be in the same political party as Southern segregationists in the 1950s or early 1960s, but that in fact is how it shook down in the middle of the 20th century. But the civil rights movement, the legal achievement of the civil rights movement in 1965 is one pivotal event. Then the collapse of the Democratic Party at the end of Lyndon Johnson's term and the Vietnam War is a sort of decisive
specifically
thing.
These 1960s, would you say that was as much a kind of social call for civil rights as it was a political move? Because as you said, the Democrats lost the Democrats in the South, but it was a very unstable coalition at that time anyways.
Yeah, but they gained, to some degree they gained an interracial coalition. And 1968 is this dramatic moment for the Democratic Party of riots outside of the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where there's a kind of total party crisis and conflict, far more dramatic than any of the party collapses that we see right now, which are in fact, I don't know whether to call them crises or collapses. I want to avoid this term crisis for reasons that maybe we can talk about. The deep tension between the party leadership, which was tainted by its complicity in the Vietnam War, facing a generational change in the form of a new left and a civil rights movement. That then leads to party reforms, which are designed between the 1968 and 1972, the reform of the political party and how elections are made, or how elections are managed. You have this commission that says, let's democratize the party in some way. Let's have primary elections rather than smoke-filled rooms.
So these primary elections, just to bring it back to today.
Yeah.
So currently the Democratic Party is one party, but there are different streamlines that exist within the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Can you maybe just outline which ones exist currently?
The factions.
Yeah. It's a hard question. On one hand, you might think of it in generational terms as much as
Party lines.
as much as party lanes. So think of a kind of Biden generation that speaks for working class whites. Okay, what do we mean by
So
that?
that's one?
That would be one. There is a interracial kind of labor coalition that had been represented by Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition of the late 80s and early 90s, which was actually extremely important and was for a while a kind of forgotten tradition and even a path not taken for the Democratic Party. That's, I think, another lane. Then there is the legacy of the Democratic Leadership Council, which is the centrist third way lane of the Democratic Party, represented most personified in the figure of Bill Clinton and then Hillary Clinton. And that was a strategic triangulating effort, not unlike Tony Blair's New Labour, that tried to win back the so-called Reagan Democrat, the working class white who had gone over to the Republican Party because they liked Ronald Reagan and so forth. Those are the three older generations of the Democratic Party, and much of the leadership is drawn from that. And there's irresolvable tensions ideologically and economically
in the current
between
primaries,
them.
who represent those groups?
Biden represents both the kind of, he claims to represent the kind of working class whites, but he's actually a fairly predictable Democratic leadership, DLC, Clintonian centrist in some way. Obama rhetorically borrowed some of the kind of multiracial mystique of a post-civil rights Democratic Party, but in fact, economically and ideologically, sided with the Clintonian wing by appointing Timothy Geithner and Larry Summers to his economic team. And then then there is, what's most interesting about the Democratic Party now is a generational turnaround. So the figure of Pete Buttigieg doesn't exactly fit into those generational trajectories. Buttigieg is what, 39, 7,
Yeah,
6?
I think 38 to be
38?
precise, but
Of course, I said four numbers, and one of them, I was wrong for three of those numbers. That is actually a new and inchoate generation, the generation, I would say, that has been shaped by the war on terror and by financial austerity.
But is that a faction that also exists in the House, let's say, that he represents?
It's a good question. No, in fact, the factions that exist in the House, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez factions, and that the squad, this term that we use for these people, that's a much more specific set of. It's not specific in the sense of specific demographics. It's actually quite a large demographic and a much more interracial and multiracial demographic, which I happen to. That's you can call that the kind of end of white America generation of the Democratic Party, which I myself am enthusiastic about. But the people in the House who represent that demographic are there because of the structure of voting districts in their different regions of
But which
the United
factions
States.
dominate the House? So there are 235 seats for House Democrats. If we had to divide those up, which factions?
how much would you say is, to do a more general term, how much would you say are the moderates? How much would you say are the kind of conservative coalition, more social democrats, more super progressives?
I don't know. I don't really have a number for you. It's probably half moderates, half moderates, a quarter. I honestly wouldn't be able to have a number. You would have a number more than I. You have a kind of granular strategic, at least in our conversations before, you have a kind of granular strategic knowledge of Democratic Party players that I myself only have a vague sense of.
Yeah, but can we make an analogy to kind of Dutch politics? Because
Yes.
assuming there's a lot of Dutch people here, which is kind of taking these generational differences and applying them to the Dutch political parties in general. For instance, if we're to say not Bernie Sanders, but Joe Biden, is he more akin to his side of the party, more akin to VVD, and is Bernie Sanders, for instance, more equivalent to GroenLinks?
Yes.
Yep, so
That
would you
sounds
say
right.
Joe Biden is about a VVD, pretty much?
Yeah. It's an interesting question whether Joe Biden is actually is more conservative than the VVD. I mean, with the standard, with national level American politics, you have to like handicap the game, a full 50% to the right. The center of American politics is probably to the right of the VVD in the Dutch context now, and that's because of the transformations of the Republican Party in the 1990s and Democrats going along with the Republican Party. So the leftist verve of the Democratic Party, or it happens to take place within the Democratic Party at the moment, that verve is actually an exciting development if you are on the left. This is an interesting moment for the revival of the left, let me say this as a point about the Democratic Party. The domestic policy leftist revival, the fact that Bernie Sanders is now a mainstream figure rather than a crank on the impossible leftist edge of American politics, that is a dramatic transformation over the past 6 years. Let's call it. Let's start the clock somewhere in the kind of the moment of disillusion with Obama-style centrism. There emerges this
Social Democrat.
yeah, kind of social democratic oomph, which is always there in American politics. It exists on the state levels, but the structures of national politics have silenced that particular drive in American on
But
the
how has
national
it
level.
silenced it, though?
Because the United States is too big, and because the parties are these national. It's too big. I always tell my students, some of whom are here, that the United States is too big to narrate and too big to govern to some degree. There is a kind of lowest common denominator effect of national political parties, and that leaves out, for various historical reasons, things that look like socialism and things that look like. Now I'm being too negative. I don't want to say that
So
American
we're going to
politics
talk
is-
more about the
we're
changing
gonna dive
Democratic
into
Party, but
Yes.
I think we quickly have to turn to our audience because I'm sure that there's some questions that they want to ask.
Any audience? That guy right there, black shirt.
Black shirt.
Just shout it out.
Shout it out.
So you mentioned the impact that Sanders has had in the party for the past 6 years. However, I don't know, at least from what I've been looking at, a lot of this change has been merely aesthetic within the wider Democratic establishment than actually supporting more Sanders-type policies. I guess the biggest example I can think of is a candidate like Warren, who has aesthetically borrowed a lot from the Sanders campaign in 2016, but if you dive a lot into the types of policies that she's supporting, it's ostensibly the same third wave Clintonite policies that the Democratic establishment has supported for the past 30-ish years.
You think Elizabeth Warren's is essentially the same as the third wave Democratic politics of the last 30 years?
Yes, especially when you look at a lot of her plans, they are still extremely rigorously mean-tested, just as a lot of the Clinton-type social welfare programs were. And she is still essentially all she's supporting are sort of the strengthening of rules while not supporting the change of structure in the United States?
It's possible that you know and even probable that you know the policy details better than I, although it seems to me that you are downplaying the genuine progressivism of Elizabeth Warren, at least within the shape of the Democratic Party now. I would not say that Elizabeth Warren has merely aesthetically borrowed the radical oomph of Bernie Sanders. I think she does represent, however, a different policy tradition, which, yes, is born in dialogue with, let me put it this way, tell me if this sounds right. Warrenism, whatever we mean by that, is born in dialogue with the Democratic Leadership Council of the 1990s. She's of that generation. And so she can speak that language of means testing. And in fact, it's true that she has operated within the system as a progressive. The Consumer Protection Bureau, all of these things are her pushing the existing political structure in as progressive a direction it will go. You can call that not radical, but I do think it is genuinely progressive, and one sign of that is the people who are against her. Both in practice, as far as I understand it, both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders wouldn't actually push for anything more radical than the New Deal of the 1930s, which was itself a kind of accommodationist, save capitalism from itself way of approaching political economy. But they announce different rhetorical traditions, which are not mere rhetoric, I should say. So Elizabeth Warren does harken back to a kind of Western progressivism and populism in the original sense of that term, a Western-born, like agrarian discontent that can be channeled through an intellectual elite like a Harvard professor who happens to believe in the redistribution of wealth. Whereas Bernie Sanders channels a genuinely radical revolutionary tradition, at least the rhetoric of that tradition. He doesn't actually want to lead a genuine revolution, but he has to call it a revolution in order to be true to his kind of 70s labor cred. But maybe I'm wrong about Warren, and she's just a closet Clintonite. But I'm not sure about that.
Let's actually touch upon these kind of fundamental, or actually not that differences in policy of the Democratic field as it stands. Because, for instance, you might say that it mirrors more Clinton policies, but you could arguably say that, for instance, when you're talking about healthcare, when you're talking about complete abolishment of private health insurance, as opposed to still maintaining a strong private influence in the healthcare field, those are pretty big differences.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about the Democratic field in general. Because we just talked about the factions and these divisions, where could you say there is no common ground among the Democratic field as it stands, or within these factions? Where are points of policies within the Democratic field that are still extremely divisive?
I mean, healthcare is the major one, and that has sucked up most of the oxygen.
And others?
Guns. I mean, all of the third rail politics. It's actually more interesting to point out the ones that are not talked about. Here, I mean, the irresolvable things are the ones that are familiar. Healthcare, like there's the Medicare for all is one kind of thing, a kind of neo Romney care, if we can call it Romney care.
We can call it that.
And then the old market system, keep your doctor, and so forth. That one is familiar. Gun control is familiar, although is taking an interesting turn. I'm very sad to say that there has not been a climate debate, a dedicated climate debate, where that remains vague on the part of the Democratic field, where partly because the Green New Deal is itself aspirational, although I would hardly, I myself would hardly embrace that and more. But that too is inchoate, partly because of the structure of these ridiculous primary elections, which I want to say that I find the process of these things quite absurd, and I hope we talk about that. I hope I get to talk about how much I despise the presidency as an institution itself.
We can talk about that.
But it's more interesting to the things that are coming into field are this to me is quite interesting about the Democratic Party now, and does not necessarily reflect well on it. The project of a leftist internationalism, the project of a left-wing foreign policy in the American context is an ongoing and quite fascinating intellectual project, but it is ongoing. But the curious phenomenon of all of the Democrats rushing to the defense of the national security state and rushing to the defense of our intelligence agencies and our military apparatus, that you can see as one of the interesting fissures of the Democratic Party. And it's partly because the Democratic Party has deferred so long to a Bush-style and Obama-perpetuated war on terror.
But even though you mentioned it,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like a big part of the discussion right now.
Although it's playing, I mean, in a way, the impeachment thing is a playing out of that. Like, how dare he go, like, he's alienating our allies. He has, and of course,
But they seem in agreement on this.
yeah, they seem in agreement on that. But pushed on an actual foreign policy, that's where.
But even taking it back to healthcare and things like this,
yeah,
it seems that there are differences in the details and not really in the fundamentals.
yeah. I think there's some differences in the fundamentals. You know better than I.
Well, because
policies.
I guess the question is, like, for instance, you can
What do I
see
know?
the conservative Democrats more typically on the right,
Yeah.
they might, I guess, debate about the details of an individual mandate as opposed to not for healthcare.
Right.
But there's also fundamental differences in the policies of how we approach healthcare. Because I could say it's a fundamental difference if you're completely for the abolishment of private health insurance,
Yeah.
as opposed to still maintaining it.
Yeah.
And I guess the question is, what is the gradation there? Do you see larger fundamental differences now than in the past, or are these still just kind of minute, detailed debates that we're having?
I think it's now become more, in a way, the veil has been drawn back, and the fact that a healthy portion of the American population, I never know the poll numbers because I'm always suspicious of them. I wonder how many people in this room have ever taken a poll or been polled. I took a survey recently that I found hilarious, and I wanted to reject the premise of every question. In fact, the significant portion of the United States that would happily embrace Medicare for all is quite remarkable. Even Bernie Sanders going on the Fox News town hall. I'm sure you have seen this clip where Bernie Sanders is speaking to the audience of what we would expect to be full dyed-in-the-wool Fox News Trump fans. And in fact, he asks them, how many of you would welcome government health care?
Yeah.
Just a round
So it
of
does seem
applause
that
for this.
This Bernie Warren group has a narrative that is catching
Yeah.
along with the American voter. It's resonating with them.
Yeah.
And why do you think their story resonates in American politics right now?
Has it always been this way?
No, it hasn't always been this way. I don't know. I mean, why is it resonating now? I think there is this is a gradual historical unfolding. If I were to say, what fundamentally are the actual tectonic fundaments of the presidential election contest now, Trump would of course be a symptom but not a cause. But the war on terror, the financial collapse, and the end of the world, the climate end of the world. Those are the three fundamental things. The party establishment, the leaders of the party, and we shouldn't, this word establishment is overused. I mean the actual people who govern and who govern party strategy have been avoiding these things, have been avoiding looking at these things directly for various reasons. For war, because they are, for the most part, compromised by having gone along with the war on terror. That was the problem of, so in a way, think of the things that Hillary Clinton, the tensions that Hillary Clinton could not resolve were about war and finance, not about climate so much. And it might be the case that political parties exist to distract from those fundamental tectonic shifts. And the Democratic Party has been, to some degree, successful insofar as it continues to exist in having a kind of, from Clinton to Obama, having a kind of message of unification, even though in the actual hard facts they were going along with the things that were eroding faith in institutions.
So their story reflects these tectonic shifts.
Yeah. So the thing. So much of the, like all things, I suppose I'm being a kind of old left Marxist historian here, but like all things, the way we talk about politics is a second order phenomenon. It's a kind of epiphenomenal thing where, why are people on the left angry at Joe Biden? It is because no banker was put in prison after the 2008 election, after the 2008 financial crisis, but the people who are angry at Joe Biden don't fully consciously realize that is why they are, in fact, angry at Joe Biden. There's a kind of inchoate political psychology. But the deep causes, I think, are the war on terror and how it has kind of unfolded in the population and in the betrayals of individual politicians, and this kind of a kind of economic malaise that is both very concrete and ambient, and then the far more total problem of environmental.
So it seems that the progressives resonate in this tectonic shift that happened.
Yeah.
But there's been a part of the party, Democratic Party, that maybe hasn't done as well, and that's sort of these pro-life, pro-gun Democrats.
Right.
And has the rise of the progressive side of the party been detrimental to this more conservative side of the party?
It's a good question. Have any of the, and here you would know better than I, as with most of these questions, how has abortion been talked about in this particular, in like the debates, for example?
So I guess we're talking more about House members. So
Yeah.
for instance, the clear example that we always bring up is Joe Manchin.
Yeah.
So he's still probably a pro-life Democrat, that he wins in his area, but he's also doesn't want to take anyone's guns away, so he's an A rating by the NRA, but he still is somewhat fiscal. But you just don't talk about abortion, I think, in those.
There seems to be
Right.
more of a nationally cultural alignment on these issues, which leaves little space for, let's say, a Democrat in Alabama to be
Right.
pro-life.
Right.
And if you're talking about this economic malaise, it's like we kind of actually need these people more than ever in those specific districts.
Why do we need those people more than ever?
Because I would argue, I'm not trying to do my own political opinions,
it.
but if you're doing the automation argument, right, that these areas, the districts that were more likely to go to Trump, were also the areas that were more likely to be automated, were exactly the area that, for instance, you probably do need this more Democrat, I guess, congressman to help against that, would be my
Yeah.
argument. But some conservatives would disagree. But it seems
Yeah.
that we are losing that.
We are losing that?
Sorry, we have our own political opinion, but
So are you worried that to deploy the cliche that the Democratic Party is veering too far to the left and is going to alienate this marginal voter in the so-called middle who
I don't
could
think
go
I
either
think
way?
it's more the
I would
idea
agree.
that if you are a part of the Democratic Party, but you don't feel comfortable, you're Christian, you're pro-gun, can you still identify with the Democratic Party if you're running for a seat?
I mean, there's the question of can you, which is yes, one should be able to. On the other hand, you're now that I understand the question a little more, it is interesting. One of the more remarkable features of the last 4 years, and there's been a good amount of writing and hand-wringing over this. The American evangelical voter surprised even me in its support for Trump in general. Like that's been the saddest thing. And I say that as someone who is quite interested in the possibilities of a religious left in the American context. We forget this.
It's happening.
Yeah, I want it to happen more, but there has been, and this is a divide within American Christianity to the extent that we can generalize about American Christianity. There is a portion of the, conservative evangelical that has made its Faustian bargain with Trump for anti-abortion reasons. And interestingly, that has not played out. That's ironically, this is something that plays out more on the state level and in the Supreme Court than it does in the actual federal legislature. That's the vanguard of anti-abortion activism has been on the states for the past 4 years, for the past 15 years actually, and on the Supreme Court level. So in a way, Joe Manchin is never compromised, never really has to face this, except when the Supreme Court becomes the topic of conversation for everybody, which is always the worst, one of the many worst moments.
So he's at a disadvantage when they talk about cultural issues.
Yeah. I don't know whether I'm afraid of the generalization, but yes.
Do you want to go for it?
No.
No?
No.
Because, there's one thing that it seems that it is pretty contentious, because Doug Jones, that got recently elected in Alabama, rightfully so.
Yeah.
You'd expect him to win against a pedophile, but essentially, him, when he joined the House, Joe Manchin greeted him and saying, "Welcome to the radical middle." So there's clearly an issue that's happening within the Democrat, I guess more the moderate, between Republican and Democrats, that they almost feel alienated by their own parties.
Yeah. Does the middle exist? The middle is a metaphor. Right and left is also a metaphor.
But for the entire, if you just
there's not a spectrum.
take that basis.
I don't think there's a spectrum. So even the statement, "Welcome to the radical middle," is actually saying, welcome to what used to be the position of the Democratic Party main caucus. Because the moment we talk about a center and a left and a right, as if that is unified, the moment we talk about it, the moment it becomes immediately artificial, where and all of our language reflects this. We speak of like populism as like, the right and the left somehow meet in this horseshoe. That too is a metaphor. And we say, Bernie Sanders represents economic populism, and Trump represents what? White ethnic, nationalist populism. Clearly, we shouldn't use the word populism for this. Clearly, the word populism is a container, is one word meaning two different things. One thing that's interesting about this moment, if we call it a crisis, or if we call it the end of the order, what we thought was a spectrum, what we thought was a single spectrum, is revealed always to have been to some degree artificial. And so the people who took pleasure, who contentedly occupied the thing called the center, were occupying a construction of their own making.
I do want to develop on this point, because I would agree for you that they are artificial, but I guess what I would say is that these two artificially created things have a very hard time disagreeing, and what I would say is the moderate is more people that classically define themselves as Republican and people that are more classically define themselves as Democrat can kind of meet at a middle ground. And that's, I guess, where we're getting more at, that it's more risky for the polarizing state that the United States already is in when you eliminate these type of Democrats and these type of Republicans. Even McCain out of office, Lindsey Graham's completely flipped, if you think about it.
Yeah, McCain. Much beloved in Europe, but McCain, of course, I wrote a 9,000 word essay about the figure of McCain in American politics, because he was such a contradiction. In a way, someone told me once that to be a moderate Democrat from the 1990s to the death of McCain, that you could define a Democrat, you could define a moderate Democrat as someone who was looking for one good Republican. That would be the definition of a moderate Democrat. And the curious obeisance paid to McCain as the last moderate Republican. If that moderate, noble Republican exists, if that figure exists, then the party system as a whole is healthy or redeemable. And there have been various figures. And of course, even that way of thinking about the relationship between the two parties is a symptom of the Republican Party winning over time, both in very visible ways and in less visible structural ways. So McCain himself gloried in that position of being the maverick Republican, but McCain was very much a typical Republican. He was also an interesting figure, a kind of literary politician in an age when literary politicians were no longer available. He was, the same generation as Philip Roth. The death of McCain and the death of Philip Roth are sort of parallel events for the death of a certain way of talking about politics. But the actual...
That no longer exists? It seems that there are no Democrats running on the point of crossing the aisle to work with Republicans.
Except Biden.
Yes? But he
Klobuchar.
pits himself against Trump.
And then some of the marginal figures. Yeah, he pits himself against Trump, but he pits himself against Trump as being a betrayer of the nobler Republican Party that once was, which is, there might be some truth to that. The Republican Party of the 90s and perhaps the 80s was also, I would find it odious because I'm predictable. I have very predictable politics, obviously, but it is also a kind of nostalgia. Now, the nostalgia might be based on something. In a way, it's an open question whether it's dead or not. And this I cannot predict. It is quite possible for it's quite possible for this terrain to change very much. Imagine in 2 weeks if Mitt Romney, Lindsey Graham, Susan Collins, and the people we think are the sensible Republican senators, imagine if they came out and said, okay, I would embrace an impeachment. I don't know how I would vote, but I would welcome impeachment as a thing. Suddenly, you can actually easily predict the major news organizations, the kind of familiar standard news organizations. I hate this phrase, mainstream media. You can imagine both CNN hosts and the Democratic Party leadership, Nancy Pelosi, for example, saying, good, sanity has been restored to the Republican Party, even though it's like 5 people out of,
it would be interesting if it happened. But I'm afraid, just because of time, we have to go back to our audience for some more questions. Are there any people who have questions?
Right there?
Yeah, in the suit.
Sorry, going back to sort of the start of the discussion where we were looking at the sort of nature of the Democratic Party, whether in terms of the House or the presidency, the primary, didn't seem to be any discussion of the role of African Americans in that, and as sort of the base of the Democratic Party, and sort of the sense of, say, Joe Biden supports and sort of the more moderate wing. Is there anything about that is worth discussing?
Yes, absolutely. In a way that is one of the central. In a way that's one of the central questions. And here, the resonance of the legacy of Barack Obama is this sort of up for grabs thing. And people would speak of the Obama coalition. People spoke of the Obama coalition as a thing, and just as a way of, one way of thinking about party politics. I'll get to that question in a second. If you're a European familiar with parliamentary systems and you're looking at the American election and saying, what the hell? That is because the party primaries are the moments when coalitions are formed. It happens to happen before the actual election. In a parliamentary system, you have the election of many parties, and then there is the jockeying for forming a government, which if you grew up in a two-party system, the parliamentary system seems to me, predictably, much more sane, although it has its own insanities, I realize. instead, now what we see is before the big election, we have this bizarre alchemy of coalition forming, some of which is behind the scenes in the sense of which candidate is going to get the endorsement of the African American civic organizations, who is the NAACP going to endorse, and that to some degree is an appeal to black spokesmen or spokesmen of the African American, to the extent that the African American community is an organized political force. You have to deal with spokesmen, and you actually have to deal with black elites. You have to deal with the black bourgeoisie, to use an old 20th century sociology term. The Obama coalition was one that totally won over for obvious reasons, but also noble and grand ones, the rhetoric, reviving the rhetoric of a civil rights generation, and also speaking the vocabulary of a new black bourgeoisie, a post-civil rights, a kind of post-civil rights generation. Obama positioned himself as closing a drama of kind of closing a wound of American life. It was not necessarily the end of racism, but that at least was the appeal. And it was extremely powerful. It was also powerful for liberal whites as much as it was powerful for, so this sort of, the Obama coalition is this kind of strange bedfellow. Now, in practice, the curious thing that's happening with the Democratic field is Biden making a plea for the old Obama coalition, although that coalition has been disillusioned. Some part of the black electorate has been disillusioned with Obamaism, whatever we mean by that. Therefore, so the support for Bernie Sanders among lower class blacks is actually is quite remarkable. Kamala Harris is the one who's also running for the mantle of the old Obama coalition. And anytime a politician does that, they have to try to transcend their own contradictory past. And so in a way that is, yes, emphatically central. And it's presumed, as it has been since the 60s, that most black voters will vote Democrat. Now, actually, however, is an interesting moment where they have to appeal for it in different ways. They can't take it for
So to take
granted.
over this question on where you appeal,
Yeah.
I think when you look at sort of the practicalities of the national elections, there's only certain states that are really defining to who becomes president. So if we look at previous elections, Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina,
Wisconsin.
where candidates spent 57% of their time. So
Yeah.
these states there really need these states to win the presidency.
Yeah.
So appealing in those states are really important. So what kind of Democrats appeal in these swing states?
I don't know.
Amy Klobuchar?
No.
But is it not important?
I'm sorry. I should not vent my disgust. I have no problem. Whatever. This depends on a structural factor. That too is changing in ways that we are unable to predict. We have a fantasy alternative history counterfactual scenario in which if Hillary Clinton had campaigned in Wisconsin, we say this, the general suffering the general anxious, fearful will say, if only we could go back in time and kill Thanos the way all of these movies, the same counterfactual fantasy that we have says, okay, if Hillary Clinton had won Wisconsin or spent more time there, made a strategic difference, then normal life would have gone on. And that's probably true, that Hillary Clinton should have done that, but
Or the Democrats could have picked a candidate who better would have appealed in Wisconsin.
Of course, but this is why the things that matter more than who campaigns where, the thing that matters more is whether states will whether states will, let voters register a few months longer rather than cutting off registration now. So it's actually it's the structural problem of gerrymandering, these gerrymandered districts, and the structural problem of voting rights, where yes, if many more states are actually up for, Texas is up for grabs for Democrats, if there was a voting rights campaign or voting rights were protected in Texas. That is.
We actually
these
want to touch
changing
on that.
socioeconomic differences are really important. So
Yeah.
Texas become increasingly more urban, better educated, and increasingly Latino.
Yeah.
Can we expect that these states are changing and Texas could go blue?
Yeah. Well, no, because Beto O'Rourke, instead of doing what he should have done, which is run for the Senate, he run for the presidency. It would have been a no-brainer. He absolutely.
But if we extrapolate this story to the United States, then in which states are changing in a way that could see them becoming more democratic?
Virginia, the Upper South, not Kentucky, but Virginia is the one that has now become a purple state. Purple again, these things. Indiana, Buttigieg being from Indiana is very important. Here's Mike Pence's state that also has Buttigieg as this, young guy who wrote his thesis.
But is it purely just personal appeal, or is it also socioeconomic?
It's also socioeconomic in ways that are. So, like Buttigieg, for example, he's a strange combination. On one hand, he is the kind of technocratic, Silicon Valley friendly mayor of South Bend in a college town, but a college town that is also in a kind of Rust Belt, post-industrial area that I myself grew up in and know very well with my Trump supporting family members.
What's the sentiment there?
The senator?
The sentiment.
Oh, the sentiment of Wisconsin? Wisconsin is the paradigmatic swing state. And I run a lot of, my mother lives in Racine, Wisconsin. I grew up in Paul Ryan's district of the former Speaker of the House and odious figure Paul Ryan, my great nemesis. And this is it's post-industrial. That is, if you want to understand American politics, you go to my mother's house. My mother is like a good, now Bernie supporting baby boomer, or Bernie or Elizabeth Warren supporting baby boomer, who feels surrounded by Trump voters, even though it's actually 50-50. It's a classic swing place.
Which states are going the other way? Which old Democratic strongholds could now be seen to be going Republican?
If there are any.
I mean, in 2016, it was like the moment when Democratic Party strategists lost their, when they lost their shit was when they saw a certain county in Pennsylvania go for Trump. That was the kind of indicative thing. And so losing Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin was the great loss. And the Democratic Party has reacted to this, some part of the Democratic Party has reacted to this by trying to get back the Trump voter. The Democratic Party did something similar in the 80s. We need to get back the Reagan Democrat, the Democrat who voted for Reagan. And this is the strategic divide within the Democratic Party, is whether to get back the person who voted for Obama in 2012 and voted for Trump in 2016. That figure, that margin. If we could only get back that margin, then we would restore our coalition, versus the people who say, it shouldn't have been that fragile to begin with. We need a broader, we need the kind of cast the net broader via voting rights and so forth. I'm probably of the latter camp, obviously, because of demographic changes because of generational changes in the broad demographic. But this is why there will be, and has been already, enormous focus on Wisconsin,
and
Ohio, and
whoever
Pennsylvania.
wins the party leadership in the primary,
Florida.
is that defining for answering that question?
Maybe. No, because once the person is in, once we've gotten over this absurd sports tournament of the Democratic primary, this ridiculous like Final Four, this ridiculous athletic event, this ridiculous Olympic scenario, or like anti-Olympic, I don't know what it is. Once we've gotten over this thing, then there will be a person, and then all sorts of then in a way then it becomes a new ball game, to use another horrible analogy.
But that person seems so important. If you see how Trump has dominated the narrative of the Republican Party, is there not the future leader of the Democratic Party going to dominate the narrative of the Democratic Party?
Yeah, but parties, I mean, I don't know. You've painted me into a corner where I don't know how to answer that question.
I guess the question is, how defining is the leadership of the party for the party?
Yeah. Unfortunately, it is too defining. Unfortunately, it should not be the case that it should not be this zero-sum game, personality-driven, one person determines it all. Of course, all politics is like this to some degree. Jeremy Corbyn defines labor in ways that, the bulk of certain labor MPs find Corbyn intolerable the same way a lot of Democratic senators and politicians would find Bernie Sanders intolerable. And you might say, that will be tragic because it will dampen voter enthusiasm and thus give away the election to Trump. That is a plausible interpretation. On the other hand, broad political mobilization should go beyond the mere presidency. I mean, here I'll show my own cards. I find the presidency an absurdly powerful institution. The one good thing that could have come of the disaster of Trumpism would be for a more or less functioning legislature to reduce the powers of the presidency, to diminish the powers of the presidency itself. That would be the one good outcome of someone so manifestly evil and stupid and crazy in the office. Now, but unfortunately, the Democratic Party now, and we see this in the primaries, everybody kind of participates in the cult of the presidency as an institution. Anytime you hear someone say, as I sometimes hear political commentators say, liberal, left, or even liberal politics will say, the president's first job is to keep us safe. Have you heard this? This is one of those sentences that I find so absurd. In fact, like if let's say poor old feeble Joe Biden becomes the Democratic nominee and even the president, that would be fine by me if there was a hugely progressive legislature and if a massive turnout was focused less on the presidency and more on the legislature, such that feeble old centrist Democrat, moderate Clintonite Joe Biden wasn't actually setting the legislative agenda, but merely receiving the legislative agenda from Elizabeth Warren, who would be one of the greatest legislators of our time, as new majority leader of the Senate. That would be fine by me. If he had a heart attack and
like
could
Bernie?
only work 4 hours a day, that would also be fine by me in a sense, because I don't think that the president has to be this athlete. The president doesn't have to be this athlete who every minute is keeping us safe.
Because you mentioned that, of course, they're kind of playing into this cult of the personality of a big figurehead. But I wouldn't say that there's many of Republicans that disagree. They would say, okay, we have finally something to agree on, limit the power of the executive.
Right.
Why hasn't it happened on both party lines?
Because they're suckers, in a way. Why does it happen? It's happened, that too has been one of these been one of these unfolding phenomena of American politics since the mid-20th century, with the establishment of the national security state that has had its own logic. The fact that, all of the things that we were so horrified about when, and I'm using this general we, all of the things that we were horrified when Trump was elected and before he was inaugurated, there were these, like the protocols of the Imperial Presidency go into effect. He now will be briefed on national security. He will be briefed on how the nuclear bomb works. He'll be briefed on these things. We see suddenly we could be horrified by the apparatus of the Imperial Presidency. And the Imperial Presidency, what that means, doesn't mean an American empire abroad. It means that the executive has been, all of these powers have swelled to the executive such that it is has a sort of imperial hegemony over the other branches of government. So this begins in a certain way with the New Deal, where the massively expanded presidential administration answers to some degree the problem of the Great Depression that arrogated power to the presidency as opposed to the legislature, and then it really is war that expands that state. So the Imperial Presidency goes into full overdrive in the Bush years after 9/11, and the legislature let that happen, or was too afraid to resist it because resisting it would seem unpatriotic. So the answer might be it's a mix of structure, a historical process that none of us can fully see because we are living in it, and a lack of courage.
Because we're running out of time, I do want to ask one last question, which I think you'll hate because it's horse race politics. Who do you think will be the nominee?
Who do I think will be the nominee? I want to entertain you and say Andrew Yang, because I know you wanted me to mention Andrew Yang, but I do not think it's going to be Andrew Yang. Who do I think is going to be the nominee? Nobody knows. Nobody knows.
Okay, who do you think should be the nominee?
Who do I think should be the nominee? Bernie, for all the reasons that I have laid out.
Because he'll get a heart attack in office.
Because for that reason, yes, that's one. Like Bernie, like age does not on one hand, it would be. Like Buttigieg is appealing because he's young, because that is a break from the gerontocratic nature of American politics, which is not just American politics, but the rule by the old, the rule by the kind of baby boomerocracy that is American politics. To break that with someone of an emphatically other generation, a generation raised in the era that came of age politically in the era of the War on Terror, that would be itself in a way, the most progressive thing, speaking in terms of a historical progress, if we understand generations as an avenue of progress. On the other hand, Bernie is this interesting figure because he's an old leftist, like a 1930s born old leftist who has appealed to millennials. So that itself is a kind of transgenerational, a transgenerational thing. I mean, I'm predictable enough that, I'd probably say, great, Elizabeth Warren. That would be my sort of preference. But again, as I just said before, I think Warren should be the majority leader of the Senate. That would be the greatest role for Warren as legislator. So I cannot answer that question.
Sadly, we do have to cut off because I still have a lot more questions actually for you that I'll ask right after this when the interview's over. But it was a serious pleasure on both of our ends. I can already tell this was extremely insightful and interesting conversation for us. This Thursday, we're going to have another guest, Dan Irelli, good behavioral economist, cognitive psychologist. And next week, we're going to have Joe Lepore, which is a Harvard historian, his boss, formerly.
My former boss.
And we've also gotten some talking points from Mr. Blaustein himself, and I hope that all of you guys turn up. Thank you for now.